Welcome back. Today's lecture is entitled Betrayal, and the focus of the lecture is how the sense of outrage appeared among the Arabs, the origin of this outrage. So I want to begin with that topic, and the setting is an important one because the setting is really the beginning of the 20th century, circa 1900. This period is widely regarded as a period when the British Empire had really reached its peak, had reached its zenith. Some of you may have seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia. The movie is really a terrible history, but it is an excellent portrayal of how the British saw the Arabs. Lawrence really had adored Arabs, but he only saw a particular variety of Arabs, the traditional Arabs, the people we call the traditional individuals. And like most of his compatriot, the British compatriot, Lawrence really never saw, in a sense of recognition, the uppity Arabs. And as we said earlier in the introductory lectures, this really is a universal pattern. It's part of the imperialist stereotype in that you really don't see the lower races rising up. You like to see them as docile. And in many ways it was the same pattern in the United States, in the South, with the uppity blacks. Lawrence's correspondence is in many ways most revealing. He wrote voluminously when he returned back to England, but never to Arabs. He wrote only to Englishmen, despite the fact that he had spent years among the Arabs. And that's because largely Lawrence liked the illiterate Arabs and the nomads, not the uppity ones. He liked the Arabs who he could tutor. And again, this is part of that imperial perception that I mentioned. So what is happening in this period, and the reason I mentioned Lawrence of Arabia, because the portrayal of the Arabs in that movie very accurately reflects the way the British are seeing the phenomena that I'm going to discuss now, and that is the recrudescence of Arab nationalism. So what is happening is that you're seeing the Arab nationalism emerging in one of those islands. Remember, we talked about the 4 islands early on. It's the Western Island that this is occurring. And within the Western Island, it's taking place in 2 centers. One is Damascus, the capital of today's Syria. And of course, the other one is Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. Ironically, the Arab nationalist movement was stimulated somewhat inadvertently by the United States. How so? Well, the American University of Beirut, also known as AUB, provided a tremendous impetus to this Arab nationalist phenomena. The students in that university end up forming the core of the Arab nationalist movement. The university was set up by American Presbyterian, and quite understandably, the first group of Arab nationalists are Christian Arabs. Later on, the movement embraces the Muslim Arabs as well. So that was one of the factors that stimulated the rise of Arab nationalism, the American University of Beirut. Now let's talk about other sorts of influences contributing to the rise of Arab nationalism. One of these was the so-called Young Turks. Going back to the 1900s, remember that marks the last years of the Ottoman Empire. And Istanbul is a very, very important center for education. Arabs who were studying there were very much influenced by the Young Turks. These are the groups of educated young men who end up creating modern Turkey out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. So one of the sources of influence was the Young Turks. The other source of influence during this period are, in a sense, you can put them into two groups, one of which was the Hashemite family, the most important family in the eastern island. That's the island that we called Mesopotamia. And so one group, of course, is the Hashemite family, and the other group are the intellectuals in the western island. The Hashemite family are in the eastern island, going back to them, and the family really traces its descendant directly to Prophet Muhammad. The western island, the intellectuals there, a lot of them, they returned home, and there was a spillover effect into the cities from this core group. So let me kind of show on the map the two groups. So the Hashemite family are on the eastern island, the area that right now is Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and the intellectuals are on the western island, and that's the greater Syria. So let me proceed with the first group, the Hashemite. The grandfather of the Hashemite family is one Sharif Hussein, and Sharif Hussein was a very important figure, so much so that the Ottomans were really afraid of him, and they kept him in Istanbul. They were afraid that if they don't keep a close tab on him, he will go ahead and start a revolt against him. Now, as the British begin to plan for World War I, keep in mind the time frame, we're moving toward World War I around 1914, and as British are preparing for World War I, they are concerned with finding the way in which they could use this important family to create some kind of a obstacle in the path of the Ottoman Empire. And their thinking at this period is that they want to have Hussein to become a puppet Khalif to rule over the Arabs once the Ottoman Empire gets defeated. So this is the line of thinking, and so that you will see that the British are approaching Hussein. I want to say a few more things about the family, so let me just give a very brief overview of the family's lineage. Let's begin with Ali. Ali is the oldest son of Hussein, and his successor is going to be Abdullah, and Abdullah at the end is murdered. Ali is destined or is expected to take over the area that is now Saudi Arabia, but already Ali is being challenged by yet another family in Saudi Arabia, or in the area we call Saudi Arabia. That was, in the past, was called Najd and Hijaz. And that's Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, the ruler of Najd. So the ruler of Najd is already challenging one of the sons of Sharif Hussein in the Arabian Peninsula, which later becomes Saudi Arabia. He is going to confront the Hashemite family, especially Ali. And after World War I, actually Ibn Saud succeeds in defeating Hussein and Ali in rather short order, and takes over the area and renames it after his family name. So the area now becomes Saudi Arabia. So in the case of Saudi Arabia, we have one of the sons being defeated by the indigenous rival family. The next son is Faisal. Faisal is actually Ali's third son. He was very much attracted to Arab nationalism, and he was supposed to have become, at some point after World War I, as you will see, the British promised him to make him the ruler of Syria. But as we will see, the French are not going to allow that. So as a consolation, the British end up giving Iraq to Faisal, and then Faisal's son succeeds him. His name is Ghazi. He had a reputation for being a playboy, and he loved fast cars, and he ends up actually dying in a car crash. And then Ghazi in turn is succeeded by his son Faisal II, and he becomes the king of Iraq until 1958. That's kind of put an end to that part of the dynasty. So Faisal II is the becomes the last king of Iraq, and then the second son is Abdullah. Abdullah was very, very angry at what happened to his brother Faisal. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, Faisal was supposed to be the ruler of Syria, but once the French prevent that, as a kind of a consolation, they give him Iraq. And Abdullah, as I mentioned, was very upset, so he decides to take on the French. But the British knew that this would lead to disastrous defeat for Abdullah, so they convince him not to do that, and instead they create an emirate or a kingdom for him, and he becomes the emir or king of Transjordan. Abdullah's son is Talal, and Talal actually was mentally deranged, so he's going to be succeeded by his son Hussein, and Hussein becomes king of Jordan. And after he passes away, he is succeeded by the current king of Jordan, who is Abdullah II. So that is a kind of a brief overview of the family, the Hashemite family, who becomes the most important group in this period, dealing with the British, trying to establish Arab nationalist, or trying to establish an Arab nation, and are really the part of the Arab nationalist movement. Now, going back to World War I, as we approach World War I, the British are really ready to consider whatever that would be necessary to bring about a disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. So on the eve of World War I, they were so desperate to make a deal that would help them confront the formidable Central Powers, including Germany, of course, that they began to negotiate with Hussein and his sons. So it was in this context that between 1915 till 1917, British end up really making 4 fateful commitments to support their Middle East objectives, one of which, of course, was to bring about the fall of Ottoman Empire. So I want to talk about these 4 fateful commitments made by British in that brief span of 2-year time from 1915 to 1970. The first part of those commitments has to do with the Sharif Hussein, the Hashemite family that I've been talking about. And this is captured in McMahon Hussein correspondence. These negotiations are, as I said, captured in these very important set of documents in the Middle East, and they're known as the McMahon Hussein correspondence. McMahon was an Oriental officer, and these correspondence are covered in one of the textbooks that I've assigned for this course. That's Smith's textbook, so you can read them directly. The idea now is to bring down the Ottoman Empire, and to do that, the British are willing to ally with the Arabs. What Hussein and his son Faisal wanted in return for their help with British and bringing down the Ottoman Empire by revolting against them was promise of independence for all Arabs. On the other hand, McMahon thought he was really talking with the king of the lower races. Remember, this assumed that there was no such a thing as public opinion in the Arab world. At the same time, as you can gather from some of these correspondence, Hussein is trying very hard to tell McMahon and to try to convince him that he was not planning to be a king, or he shouldn't be conceived of as the king, but rather as a representative of the Arab nations and of Arab nationalism. So this is part of the kind of a misunderstanding, if you like, with the perception of McMahon versus the aspiration of Sharif Hussein regarding the ideas they have about how to go about their common interest, which is bringing down the Ottoman Empire. So what Hussein is trying to communicate is that the land is changing pretty rapidly. Public opinion was beginning to emerge, especially in the urban centers and among the educated Arabs, so that the British would be advised well to pay attention to it, because certainly this traditional family Hashemite understood that this is what was happening. Also, note that how presumptuous the British were, in that they really didn't own or occupy any part of the Arab Peninsula. It wasn't even under their control. Yet, they were already setting the terms and negotiation criteria for the Arabs' future land, even though that land didn't even belong to them. Now, in these negotiations, the British wanted to exclude the Western Island. Remember, the Western Island is the Greater Syria. But Hussein wanted to include it because obviously Greater Syria was a critical part of an independent Arab state. And remember, this was the central island outside of the Eastern Island in which the effervescence of nationalism or Arab nationalism had begun to manifest itself. So there is this disagreement between Hussein, that wants to include the Western Island, and McMahon, that wants to exclude it. To get the negotiations moving, they agree to disagree on the western boundaries of an independent Arab state. So in short, on the basis of Hussein-McMahon correspondence, in return for Arab uprising against the Ottomans, the British committed themselves to support an independent Arab state whose western boundaries remained ambiguous. Now, why the disagreement about the western boundaries? Well, the British were mostly concerned with France, who was their ally and had interest in Syria. Arabs, on the other hand, believe that British were really solely concerned about the Jews. But at this juncture, it was the French interest that the British were being very mindful of rather than the Jews. And this will come out very quickly as we talked about the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916. So to sum up, the British promised Arabs independence after World War I in return for Arabs' uprising against the Ottoman. After that, the Arabs are now in rebellion. Lawrence of Arabia is active in the region, helping to get the revolt off the ground. And so this ends the first commitment, or at least my discussion of the first commitment that the British made, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence.